Turkish minaret guards the harbour. An Anzac graveyard lines the sea. But for a stretch of water and a space of time, this could be Gallipoli, but it's not. These Australians who once smiled broadly and walked this earth proudly with an undefeatable optimism for life are buried in Greek soil. They were the sons of the men who fought at Gallipoli. They grew up so close to the Anzac legend, they could not see its cautionary tale.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
This year, Australia commemorated the 75th anniversary of the birth of the Anzac legend, when Australian soldiers came ashore here at Gallipoli and went on to endure 8 months of slaughter. What is worrying about the disaster of Gallipoli is that after all that had been spoken and written about it, 26 years later, we would, with the minimal of questioning, embark on a remarkably similar campaign. Across the Aegean, in Greece in April 1941, the Second Anzac Force was formally proclaimed. This time, the Australians and New Zealanders were fighting the Germans. In the space of weeks, hundreds of Anzacs were dead. Thousands were taken prisoner as the remaining forces were pushed into the sea. On Anzac Day 1915, the fathers waded into the sea over there. On Anzac Day 1941, the sons waded into the sea also, right here. But while the fathers were advancing, the sons were in retreat. And in retreat too was the Anzac legend. For this time in Greece, the defeat was a defeat, which returned the Australian soldier to the ranks of the mortal. The retreat of the Anzac legend on April 25, 1941 is not widely commemorated. Perhaps it should be. The message, though less appealing, is far more worthwhile. But Anzac Day, a holiday, is not a good day for lessons. Remembrance is an emotional occasion, and messages become diluted by beer and sentiment.
I used to sneak off and come home.
The soldierly habit of neither asking nor answering awkward questions is revived annually.
That was not his territory. Those village.
Today, amidst the smell of beer and rosemary, there is careful conversation. The men don't talk of the guts and the gore and even the bloodshed, I suspect out of sensitivity to the suffering of relatives still alive. They will never talk of personal heroism because Australians can't be seen to be boasting before their mates. And probably because it doesn't conform to the Anzac legend, they will still only rarely speak of defeat.
You ever heard of a fighter talk a lot about his defeats? No, you hear about his victories, you never hear about the defeats. I think, let's face it, we were thrashed. We should be ashamed of it.
Australia's answer to a call that has become more urgent than ever. Yet another Australian contingent in the making.
We have told ourselves we grew up after Gallipoli, that we would not again be defeated, killed or captured for no sensible reason, that Australians would never again mindlessly submit to the presumed wisdom of the mother country. But when you look for evidence of a distancing from Britain in 1939, it's hard to find.
Are you natural-born British subject? British subject? My own, I am.
Well, the feeling generally, I think, and certainly it was in my case, that we were British stock. We're part of the British Empire.
There was a very high proportion of sons of old digs. and they just took it just for granted that Britain was at war, and Menzies, of course, declared we were at war too, and they took it for granted that they would enlist in any overseas force.
The first to join were known as the 39ers, and out from the shelter of the gum trees and past the post and rail fences they marched, the first and the finest, eager to answer the call of the mother country and eager to live up to the reputation of their fathers.
Who could measure up to them? I don't know. This was pretty much unspoken, I suppose, among our people, but you wanted sort of not to let them down.
We wanted to live up to the past reputation that Australians had for being ready to stick their necks out if it was a serious matter.
Like their fathers, they expected to be sent to England, and like their fathers, they were instead propelled towards the Middle East. An Australian public eager for news of success did not have long to wait. In 1940, Italy joined Hitler's war. In the first days of 1941, British and Australian soldiers attacked the Italian fortresses at Bardia.
They surrender in battalions to what Rome Radio called hordes of bloodthirsty Australians.
The Australians were probably the best disciplined, best trained soldiers we'd yet sent overseas. Their success would have astonished even their fathers and done nothing to dampen their own sense of invincibility. In the space of a month, thousands of Italian prisoners were taken, a treasury of booty counted, and the prisoners duly, meticulously debriefed.
And you've heard of Australia? Have you heard of Australia? Of Australia? No. Have you ever? No. No.
Fortunately, the Allies had more valuable intelligence to rely upon. British codebreakers had secretly cracked the German cipher and learned something of Hitler's plan to occupy Greece. At the time, Germany virtually owned Europe. Italy was having its other eye blackened in the fighting against Greece on the Albanian frontier. Germany considered moving through Yugoslavia towards Greece to come to the aid of the Italians, as Britain considered crossing the Mediterranean to come to the aid of the Greeks. Greece's General Metaxas at first rejected the British offer. He was worried the British presence might invite attack from the Germans. The British War Cabinet under Winston Churchill persisted, Metaxas died, and Greece finally relented.
I think the War Cabinet came to the conclusion that going to Greece was the best thing to do. And there are a number of reasons for that. Not all military. For example, they thought they needed to go to Greece to indicate that they're fighting the Germans and they're supporting small countries that are opposing a dictator. They needed to demonstrate to the Americans that they're really taking the war to the Germans. And these were important considerations, diplomatic considerations of support from other neutrals. So these are what politicians are about, weighing military advice against political diplomatic advice.
In the first months of 1941, Britain, under constant attack from the German Air Force, was feeling alone and desperate for allies. The noble gesture of coming to the aid of the Greeks might also encourage Turkey and Yugoslavia to join the Allies. But most important, it might lure the powerful and still neutral United States of America towards the struggle.
How valid was the concern that American opinion was important?
Well, it was important insofar as they were financing the British effort. So in that sense, it was vitally important. But insofar as the Americans caring whether the British supported the Greeks or not, that is a very moot point. And people said afterwards, the Americans in fact declared afterwards, that they wouldn't have cared a hoot whether the British supported the Greeks or not.
If ordinary Australians could be faulted for a failure to ask questions, their leaders were no better. Australia's Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, was on his way to join the British War Cabinet when the Greek proposal was being discussed. When he stopped in the Middle East, Menzies did not even discuss the fate of the troops and this risky venture with his Commander-in-Chief, General Blamey, let alone seek Blamey's advice.
Well, he'd been forewarned by the High Commissioner in London, so he knew it was going to go on. He knew it was a chancy enterprise, and he knew once he got there that it was on the cards and that Australians might well be involved. But he didn't take it up with the British commanders on the spot.
He didn't take it up with General Blamey either.
I think it was a serious dereliction of his duty as Australian Prime Minister.
Yes, but Blamey also can be blamed for this, and Blamey, for all his vast experience, showed inexperience as a commander of a national force in not immediately telling the Australian government what was going on.
The latest Ministry of Information press conference heard the newly arrived Australian Premier.
People of this country must very frequently be tempted to feel that they have the world against them.
Blamey's advice finally reached Menzies, now in London. Menzies was warned that the Greek enterprise was extremely hazardous. The Prime Minister was told of fears of a piecemeal dispatch to Europe and worries about handing control of the troops to the British. Menzies was now worried too, but it was too late. We had, as at Gallipoli, already committed our troops. As the historian Gavin Long noted, the habit of accepting the solution offered by senior British leaders was deeply ingrained.
We are the family, and when there is trouble in this world, every member of the family knows just where he is, and he's going to remain there until the trouble is over.
3,000 to 4,000 civilians were being killed or wounded each week.
The senior British leader most captivated by the Greek campaign was, as it happened, the man who led us to Gallipoli, Winston Churchill. Churchill was again, it seems, romanced by the prospect of a classic Spartan stand on an ancient battlefield.
Well, that was part of it, but it was also the idea of vindicating himself over Gallipoli. When he had been thrown out of power in 1915, the idea that one could have this Balkan bloc that could strike at the soft underbelly of Germany in the way that he wanted to do in 1915. He thought if he could do it in the Second World War, then in the eyes of history, Churchill would be vindicated.
Menzies, in his own words, was like the new boy before the school captain. When he tried to stand up to Churchill, the Australian Prime Minister was blitzed. Churchill ran the war from here in the underground War Cabinet rooms. In Menzies' private writings, he described the War Cabinet as deplorable, dumb men, most of whom disagree with Winston, but none of whom dare to say so. But to these dumb men, we listened and dutifully followed our orders. The parallels with Gallipoli are remarkable. Once again, Anzac troops would be dispatched across the Mediterranean, once again to attack the soft underbelly of Europe. Again, it was a risky enterprise, and again, the main architect of the scheme was the man who sat here, Winston Churchill. But this time, there was something even worse than Gallipoli, because this time they knew the scheme must fail.
While there's a dizzy street, wherever there's a turning wheel, a million marching feet. Red, white, and blue, what does it mean to you? Show your proud shouting aloud, drifts away, the infantry.
In the first weeks of March, an advance party of Anzacs sailed for Greece. 9 days earlier, the head of the British Foreign Office advised that the expedition must, in the end, be a failure. The Director of British Intelligence at the same time warned at the likely loss of all forces in Greece. While the men were on their way, Churchill cabled his foreign minister stating, "We do not see any reason for expecting success." The Australians were told nothing of this, making do with their own rudimentary intelligence. The Australians weren't told their destination until they boarded the ships and the officers briefed the men.
Well, Bully was a Victorian farmer, and he was told to tell us how to behave in Greece. And he did his best. He said, well, you know, the first thing to remember, I suppose, is that Greeks are not wogs or niggers. And, you know, they're our allies. And we're not going there to beat the place up, and we'll treat them decently. He said, and of course, they're pretty strong on civilization. For instance, they invented the Olympic Games.
Greece, no, that wasn't dull at all. It was a lovely place to go to. We'd come straight from the desert, sand, rocks, and we come into the green of Greece because it was at the time, beginning of April, and you still had the benefit of the overhang from winter, and it was very pleasant.
Then he, you know, told us that they were very particular about their women, and passes and girls were not appreciated in Greece, and that they had bloody awful beer like that rubbish you get in New South Wales, and stuff called ouzo, he said, which is like arak, and on no account have anything to do with that.
That first night I spent in Athens in a little taverna, and there were some young Greek soldiers that had not long come down from the Albanian frontier. And all I can remember is trying to get back to camp.
You go to my head and you linger like a haunting refrain, and I find you spinning round in my brain like the bubbles in a glass of champagne.
For the next month, the troops continued to arrive and make their way north. The men were from our prized 6th Division. They were the 39ers, our best trained, most experienced fighting force. A total of 17,000 Australians, about the same number of New Zealanders, and about 22,000 British troops were sent to Greece. In all, about 60,000 troops arrived, less than half the number Churchill promised. From the start it was known we would be hopelessly outnumbered on the ground and more particularly in the air. We expected 23 squadrons, there were only 9. What every soldier knew is they would not survive in Greece without adequate support from the Air Force. But of all the RAF squadrons promised for Greece, less than a third ever turned up. The glorious few who did fly were often more swiftly sacrificed than the men on the ground. One who did survive is a writer now living in Buckinghamshire.
We had a feeling, I know I had a feeling anyway, that when I first arrived, 10 days before the complete collapse and evacuation, that this was a total debacle and that we had no hope at all. And I remember saying to myself, what do they want to send me out here in a brand new hurricane for, which is never going to get back again, especially the machine and possibly me.
Was the Greek campaign winnable? Did you believe it was winnable when you were heading north in Greece?
Well, you don't think of things like that. I was then on divisional headquarters, and I don't think anybody really had in his mind you automatically appreciate the situation and the forces, and it looked pretty grim, but I don't think we gave much of a second thought to it, really.
Hitler sent a powerful, well-supported army towards Greece. They would meet the Allies here in the north of Greece. The German military machine to approach Greece was the same which conquered France in weeks. The German army was fighting on no other front in Europe at the time. 20 superbly equipped divisions were assembled for the conquest of Greece. They faced a battered, ill-equipped Greek army, some patched-together British units, one New Zealand division, and 1 Australian division. Before going into action, the Australians were marched day and night over these hills to where the Germans were expected. So difficult was the march, when the Victorians from the 2nd 8th Battalion finally arrived here at Vevey, it was as if they'd already fought an exhausting battle.
They were also, well, there's a rude word, but let me say, use the word stonkered. They were also stonkered.
A long grey column of German tanks and soldiers crossed the Yugoslav border over there, made their way across this plain to here, where the khaki-clad men of the AIF were dug in and waiting. The Australians were tired, but they were the sons of the Anzacs. With this inheritance and the pride they carried from their success against the Italians, as one said, they were 8 foot tall and bulletproof. And they were in for a shock.
Artillerie und Stukas zu hämmern die Metaxas.
It certainly looked like a swarm. You could scarcely see the countryside with German tanks and German trucks and so on. And I thought, you lucky flaming Germans, if you fight, you've got all the mod cons, whereas we haven't even got our mortars. I got caught in a gully with a tank sitting up at the top end and machine guns on both sides and infantry coming over the top. And I was getting out as fast as I could along this gully, and I look round, and here is just up over the knoll is this grinning thing called a tank, just happily letting fire at me. I was no danger to them, but it just made me so angry, I pulled out my useless pistol, and I let fly and said, "Take that, you bastard." I know it made no difference to the war, but it did make a bit of a difference to me.
The Australians fought for as long as they could. A cornerstone of the Anzac tradition is the Australian soldier never discards his weapon and runs away.
There was no way in the world they were going to move and get out of there with their gear. They got them to discard their equipment, and they were absolutely exhausted. They could not stand up with their equipment on.
If you wanted to be killed, you stayed there, slowly, moved slowly and formally. If you wanted to get out and fight again, you really better get out, not make a target for too long.
The Australians who discarded their weapons and retreated from Vevey felt no shame. They knew they'd done their best. Outside their ranks there was bewilderment, and later there would be recrimination. This was not supposed to happen. But at the time, with the Germans advancing fast and attacking the retreating columns from the air, there was no time for soul-searching. As the Australians retreated, their headquarters at Ellison came under attack. In the town and along the roads, nowhere was safe.
A lot of Stukas came in. Well, they tell me, I don't know till afterwards, that the Stuka bombs had screamers on them, you know. If they were meant to frighten you, they worked, I can tell you that.
We're going helter-skelter down this road, and all of a sudden 3 Messerschmitts came across. All I could see was the centre of the road, perfectly centred, erupting. And all I could see, the Jerry and the guns in the wings. And I had a vision of my mother sewing a piece of material and me going under it, and this is how I'd be sewn with his ruddy machine gun.
Many of the soldiers sheltering in the roadside ditches claimed they never once saw one of their own planes. The men on the ground were constantly complaining about where was the RAF. Did you not know anything about this at the time?
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. I hardly knew that the majority of the army was composed of Australians, for example. None of us knew where the army were, or what they were doing, or whether they were retreating or holding their own. I got the feeling, the one feeling I got strongly was that the RAF officers in charge, there was an Air Commodore there and somebody else, they were real old bumblers. Not very bright. No, really not.
In a little over a week, the Germans had conquered half of Greece. New South Welshmen from the 2nd Battalion attempted another stand here at the Pineus River.
Well, if we could have stopped the tanks, there would have been a chance, but sheer weight of numbers would have got rid of us. You know, there's just too many of them. And they just kept coming and coming. And, you know, the blokes, the word went out. I don't know who said it, but they said, well, you know, out, get out.
Well, we were just a rabble running, and there's nothing worse in this goddamn world than turning your back on the bastards and running. It is a heart-wrenching, gut-tearing, bloody experience that nobody would appreciate unless it ever happened to them.
I remember jumping up. It's funny, the bloke said they're like a bloody rabbit. I said, yeah, you shoot a rabbit, it jumps up in the air, comes down, whop. Well, that's just what I done. I got hit. Jumped up and run about, I suppose 5 yards. And then, you know, the ground come up and hit me.
You were just scared stiff and ran. I was carrying a Bren gun in one hand and I had a ring that my wife had given me, and only ring I've ever worn in my life, and had a watch on, and by the time I finished running up that waddy, I had a Bren gun carry handle and not another belly thing. They were all just ripped off.